Well, they decide who speaks first.
Thanks. I remember being at the National Book Award ceremony a couple of years ago, and Steve Martin was the MC, and all these well-behaved authors and publishers timidly coming up to get their award. It's like, give a woo, give a woo. So here's my woo. It's an honor to have this prize. I remember when we acquired this book, I actually thought the thought that you dare not utter until you're standing here, which is like, this could be a prize winner. So Chris Rogers, the acquiring editor of the Atlas of Transatlantic Slavery, began this project shortly after coming to Yale in 2005. We saw it as a perfect fit for the press and the university, given Yale's rich legacy in the field of slavery studies. He pitched the idea to David Blight, who was the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery and Abolitionism. David and his colleague Rob Forbes enthusiastically embraced the idea and recommended David Eltis, who's with us today, and David Richardson as the best candidates for authoring this atlas. It's difficult to imagine anyone but Eltis and Richardson as the lead authors, given the many years of research they have given to documenting the voyages of the slave trade and creating the Voyages website with a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. I should also recognize that Carol Watson from the NEH is with us as well today. The transatlantic slave trade persisted for 366 years and resulted in the forced deportation of 12.5 million Africans to the New World. It is a phenomenon that we have struggled with for centuries as historians, as students, as writers, as American citizens. It's not only one of history's greatest crimes against humanity, but also an event of such magnitude and importance that it is impossible to represent adequately. Not being able to grasp the scale of the story or find a way to tell it has been tantamount to our cultural inability to sufficiently reckon with it. The magnitude of the event astounds. By 1820, African slaves constituted some 80% of all immigrants to the New World since 1500. The average death count on board the ships negotiating the Middle Passage was 15%. Modern capitalism, or the economic fortune of the Americas, would be unimaginable without this exploitation of human capital. With the Atlas of Transatlantic Slavery, scholars David Eltis and David Richardson have given us an invaluable key to understanding the Atlantic slave system. The highly detailed collection of nearly 200 maps, especially created for the book, explores every detail of African slave traffic. Based on an online database, the project draws on 35,000 slaving voyages, covering roughly 80% of what we know of all such voyages ever made. We learn which nations participated in slave trade, where the ships were outfitted, where the captives boarded ship, where they were landed in the Americas, and finally, the geographic dimensions of the eventual abolition of the traffic. We learn how the winds and currents of the North and South Atlantic resulted in two mostly separate slave trades, one connecting Africa with Portuguese Brazil, and the other Europe, the Caribbean, and Africa. Professors Eltis and Richardson have made unprecedented empirical discoveries, beginning with a continually expanding demographic census. They record slave revolts and mutinies, those momentous occasions of heroism and human drama which inhibited even larger numbers of atrocities. They document the surprising and upsetting complicity of Africans in creating and maintaining the slave trade. There are also stunning art and primary materials exhibited in the Atlas to tell the human side of the story outside the maps. It is easy to forget that this is a story about real people when one turns page after page of maps and tables that quantify the business of slavery so starkly and dispassionately. But it is this very lack of sensationalism and sentimentality that brings home the awfulness of the atrocity. By adding art and diary entries, poems, letters of slaves, the Atlas also gives the reader a humanistic counterbalance to the geographic sark citations in the maps. The maps, however, are the headline story of the book. The plan was for 125 originally, but we ended up with over 200 four-color maps. Don Larson of Mapping Specialists, Paul LaChance of University of Ottawa, and the famous geographer Harm de Blaye pored over every map, and of course the authors and the editorial advisory board worked together as a well-oiled machine in refining and ensuring that they would be accurate, original, and accessible. This was terribly challenging because nothing like them had ever existed, and everything needed to be conceived from scratch. We thank that cartography team and their excellent work. The Voyage's website, if you haven't seen it, is a phenomenal database about the slave trade in the Atlantic from the 15th to the 19th century. It includes far more data than the atlas could ever hope to contain, as well as a dynamic interactive learning experience. Several maps from the atlas were used on the Voyage's site, and the cartographic team Yale employed for the atlas was worked with Emory and the NIH team from the start. This has been a richly collaborative experience. There are many others to thank as well. David Blight helped organize author-editor meetings in New Haven and wrote a very moving epilogue. David Bryan Davis wrote a superb introduction to the atlas so that any reader could enter this world with a sound understanding of the history of the slave trade. And then there's Robert Harms of Yale History Department, who's the African specialist who saved the teams on several occasions by correcting and advising us on all things African. This is as much an African story as anything else, and the maps are populated with real, young, old, male, female Africans detailing the regions they lived in and the languages they spoke. And then there's the money we needed to pay for the maps, the art, the research, the team expenses, the meetings. In 2005, Yale raised over 100 grand in grant money to help pay for the atlas. Eric Pappenfuse, a bookseller in Pennsylvania, actually gave us the largest gift. The Gilder Lehrman Institute, the University of Hull, and several restricted endowments at Yale also helped subvene the project. And of course, none of this would have been possible without the NEA support of the Voyage's website. At Yale, I'd like to single out Mary Pasty, the manuscript editor, who took on the daunting job of correcting inconsistencies and refining literally thousands of loose ends to perfect the project to the state that sits in front of you today. So the other night, as I was packing my suitcase, I tried to explain to my 14-year-old daughter what this award means. And she says, is that like your Oscars, she asked me? Actually, she's 14, she was like, is that like your Oscars? Yeah. No, not exactly. It's more like the Screen Guild, I said, where the industry examines itself and recognizes its peers. So honored to receive this award from such a distinguished group of judges. David Bryan Davis, in his introduction to the Atlas, writes of our contemporary discomfort in using the word evil. But it's hard to find another word that describes the traders who subjected the captured slaves on board the ships to such inhumane conditions. Professor Davis further extends the lessons to be learned from the shameful chapter of our history, and I quote, "Our Western culture tends to worship the image of the free market, the invisible hand that allegedly promotes the common good. Yet it was uncontrolled market forces that determined how many African slaves could be crammed into the hold of a ship, with the chained and padlocked males lying together for 5 weeks or more, hunched on their sides, wedged like spoons, locked together, unable to stand or stretch out, surrounded by feces and urine-drenched floors to satisfy consumer demand for sugar, rum, tobacco, and coffee. As it happened, these stimulants did little to improve the world or enhance human health and well-being. If history can teach us some unexpected lessons," Professor Davis continues, "here is one. We should recognize that Britain's 1807 law, which ended the country's 130-year dominance of the slave trade and led to the economic decline of the British Caribbean, was a revolutionary move toward regulating the global market. And it is this way that the evil mistakes of our past can teach us lessons today." So in closing, I just wanted to give a shout out to what all of us in this room does every day. We all agree that the digital technology is both enhancing and troubling our publishing industry, but in my humble view, a book like the Atlas and other books that were nominated today point a way forward, especially for us not-for-profit scholarly presses, a return to our roots, really, in the way we commission the discovery of primary documents and empirical evidence, help to set up the scholarly commentary and analysis of those materials, and disseminate the findings in a physical book that draws, focuses, curates, and analyzes. The digital revolution, in fact, returns us to our original mission, that the book is the mark in time in which the research is culled and refined. It is the physical manifestation of the thought experiment, a supreme intellectual endeavor that we have spent centuries cultivating. It begs the question, what needs to be a book? And I would offer that the Atlas needs to be a book, a reference book, in fact, because it fulfills various obligations. The research demonstrates a passionate commitment and almost athletic joy in managing masses of new primary documents and material. The structure invents a new model of managing that complexity. The prose contributes terminology to the lingua franca of the discipline. The book crosses disciplines with ease. It listens to its own internal echoes. And while perhaps narrow in scope, the book feels close. You can feel the breadth of the intellect on the page. Some of the foodies among us will know that the Italians have a phrase, slow cooking, to describe an activist rejection of all things prepackaged, processed, fake, and an embrace of all things natural, whole, organic, and handmade. And there may be a lesson for us. The information on the web and our digital platforms is only as good as what we feed it. It's great for finding out what you want to know, but less good in discovering what you might know you want to know. That is what books are for, whether in print or digital, to empower a single, deliberate mind at work to reach another mind. Not so much slow cooking as slow thinking. At any rate, we're honored to have with us today David Eltis, the co-author of the Voyage's website and the Atlas, and I'd like you to welcome him to the podium.